Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm sorry I was unable to attend yesterday because we had exams in Turin. But this conference resonates very much with my general interest and the evolution of my thinking about the law as a social phenomenon. Um, I would like to address this conference in a way to um, share with you why a lawyer would be interested and should be interested to this kind of area of knowledge. And in my own experience, I arrived to the challenge, the fundamental challenge to scientific positivism, which is basically, I would say, the epistemological shift from modernity to the current stage through a long scholarly process that I started at least 25 years ago when I published a book called Plunder When the Rule of Law is Illegal with anthropologist Lauren Ader. And at the time, that book was a deconstruction of the narrative of the rule of law as a dominant concept and a hegemonic concept in legal thought globally. And we developed a quite hard critique. And when I was going around for presentations of the book, and everybody was always asking for a pars construens. Okay, so okay, the critique should be hard and should be merciless, but it is necessary to have some sort of the vision forward. And the elaboration of the vision forward brought me to study the commons as a legal concept. And the commons is a legal and social reconstruction of categories that have been traditionally framed in the legal tradition within the binary mechanistic paradigm, separating the observer from the observed and the subject from the object, that is part of the Western legal tradition. And the commons are a first very fundamental critique of the possibility of such separation. So when we talk about humans and things, the commons challenge the idea that there are humans and there are things, because there is an integration of the commoners with the object of the common. And the common becomes a common because people participate into it and contribute to it and care about it. And there is a very strong identity subsumption of the common object, let's call it that way, with the subjectivity of the commoners. So a commoner is a commoner because there is a common, but a common is not a common if there are not the commoners, and the commoners being subjects. Okay, so this kind of circular relationship between the subject and the object seems to me that is kind of the structure within which also this conference has been developing. And I reached a sort of pars construens in the book with Fritjof Capra, The College of Law. Fritjof is a physicist. He's very well known for his dance of Shiva metaphor, looking basically into evolution in physics as a substitution of a holistic paradigm to the mechanistic paradigm that was out there before and that characterizes the Western modernity. And from Capra, I started to think about the legal system as something that was basically impossible to understand within the old structural binary vision of subject and object, and within the sort of scientific paradigm. Uh, the question after the College of Law became, how would you handle legal problems and legal issues, getting rid of what are the foundations of the legal discourse? In other words, the legal discourse, in particular, the legal discourse of modernity, have been very strongly structured within modernity, within the Cartesian paradigm, and within the positivistic assumption. In the law, the evolution has been a slow but very radical critique that happened over time of what is known as legal positivism. That critique has been part of the intellectual legacy of one of our great mentors of comparative law, Professor Rodolfo Sacco, and of the other big mentor of mine, at least, but certainly one of the key figures in the global comparative law, which is Rudi Schlesinger. They both criticize very harshly the idea of legal positivism, and comparative law has been seen as a jurisprudential evolution, as a way to get out of legal positivism. Okay, legal positivism, assuming the necessary connection between the political boundaries and the law, have been criticized by comparative law in a way as part of its DNA. This critique, however, has not been sufficient, because it was a critique of legal positivism based on ideas of scientific positivism. In other words, the legal critique of legal positivism was embedded in a vision that assumed the possibility to separate in a very ontologic way what is the is from the ought in the law, okay? The is from the ought to be. A claim that comparative law and law was about observing and describing a reality which is out there, okay, to be kept separated from normative ideas and platforms to change the reality through law reform. But we were still very much, and we still are to a great extent in comparative law even today, within a vision which claims the possibility to separate objectivity from subjectivity, okay? The is from the ought. What is out there from what is ought to be out there, keeping them separated. The law being easily severable from the sort of political platform of transformations and change. That assumption was very fruitful. It worked very well in understanding law as a phenomenon that is emerging and is out there today, but would not solve the problem, of maintaining the positivistic critique at a deeper level, okay? So to try to do this deeper construction, the fundamental question that one has to ask is how can we handle legal discourse if we do not believe anymore in the fact that the observer can be maintained separated from the observed. This is one of the very basic ideas of quantum mechanics as I understood it in a way. So that is to say, in the world of the very small, the very fact of trying to observe determines what is observed, okay? So the machine that is used in order to make the observation is actually determining what is kind of possible to be observed. And so there is, just to follow right away the practical meaning of that, there is a clear attempt to consider data as something that exists and can be observed as such. And if you think about it, when we talk about data science, for example, or big data, or all the ideas about data that are out there today, they are still in the point of view of something that is there. In fact, this is not the reality. If we look at the technological conditions and the technological processes today, we see very well that data as such don't exist. What exists is what is captured. Okay, so the data exists because someone captures the data. And, the surveillance society, the surveillance capitalism works on a sort of naturalization of an idea of data, which is in fact a political act of capturing. Okay, this is already showing, how this sort of maintaining separate our paradigmatic methodology, the separation metaphor, the mechanistic reductionist metaphor of modern science, really doesn't work very well to see what is occurring today, what are the deep transformation. And this is when I was kind of a little lost. I was saying, well, what should we observe now? What should we study now, and how can we tackle this very fundamental epistemological problem. And because in a way, there is a structural incompatibility between our vision of law, okay, and the reality today. The vision of law that we have is structurally incompatible in the very deep sense, in a very deep epistemological sense of what we are observing in society in this current day. And this is when, you know, the scholar is supposed to ask the fundamental questions. So where to ask the fundamental question? I resorted to the old, very old in a way, if you think, materialistic dialectical paradigm. The law is determined by the technological conditions of production. Okay, the law is not an autonomous field. Is certainly semi-autonomous, but is deeply connected with the processes of production and the way in which we actually operate within certain kind of material conditions. Okay, and the material conditions today, as opposed to the material conditions 30 years ago, are the fact that we live most of our time connected online. The average Westerner and lives more than 8 hours a day connected through devices. And this is true not only in the West. There are about 4 billion people that are constantly connected over smart mechanisms and that live a large part of their existence in what I call the technological frontier. They live somewhere else. And this is very much connected with what we're talking about here, because clearly that is an artificial space, and the very idea of things, when you go to look into the frontier of technology, loses its meaning in a very visible and concrete way. Okay, a book usually was a piece of paper containing a physical object and could be treated as such. Okay, once a book is online and or something is just in a non-paper form, loses its materiality and enters in a world that is governed by a logic which is very different from the mechanistic logic and the fundamental logic. So I said, well, this being the conditions of modernity, of postmodernity in a way, the conditions of our time, then we have to see what happens to the law. And what I observed is, I left that in a series of papers that I published recently, and then in a small booklet that I just published a few months ago, which is called "The Death of Law," and this what I call the great substitution hypothesis. In other words, the law declines in its role in society because it is substituted by the smart form of our life on internet. Okay, it's much easier to govern a society through algorithm and through predictions patterns that are contained in the algorithm, what Zuboff called surveillance, okay, outside of the legal form, because the legal form is expensive, is complex, and especially is not useful anymore for the process of accumulation. This is very, very important. The law declines and gets substituted by the technological devices because it's not useful anymore as it used to be for the process of capital accumulation. Okay? The law has been fundamental structure of capital accumulation throughout modernity. Okay? Without law, there would be no capitalism. Without property rights, contractual rights, tort, there would be no possibility to accumulate capital and to develop in the way we developed as a capitalist society. And therefore, the lawyers had a very fundamental role in the making of modernity and in the making of capitalism. And this role was created by the, so to say, dual position of law, being at the same time the sword in the hands of power, So the power determines and controls society through the law, but on the other hand, also being a shield of the individual against power. Okay, so the law plays its role within this double function, which is fundamentally different. One is helping out the powerless against the power, and the other is helping the power against the powerless. And there is a dialectic between these two functions of law. And this dialectic was determined, I believe, at least that is the great substitution hypothesis that I try to develop. That idea is determined by the fact that lawyers could preach some values to power, and power had to listen to lawyers because lawyers were necessary to power itself. In other words, the lawyer were not there, and the legal culture, what we call the legal culture, the legal tradition, the legal principles, legal ideology, all what we have around this broad idea of legal culture could develop because the power needed lawyers and therefore had to listen to their preaching. Okay, so the power had to take into consideration the values of the lawyers, because otherwise the lawyers would not cooperate in the construction and the accumulation of power. Okay, in the internet frontier, this relationship of mutual necessity, which is kind of Hegelian in a way, okay? In a way, the law serves the power needs the law, and therefore the power listens to the law in order to self-legitimize, okay? Is completely disappeared because over the internet, there is no need for the law for capital accumulation. The logic of the internet and the logic of the reduction of legal transaction to data is incompatible with the law, in the sense that the law is just introducing kind of hurdles and breaks to capital accumulation. Capital accumulation can work much better without law today through the internet than it ever could work. Okay, so this is very important. The consequence of the fact that you can accumulate over the internet through measures of self-help, capital accumulates determining its own code and its own rules, okay, marginalizes the lawyers. The lawyers now preach to someone who doesn't need them anymore. And therefore, because they don't need us anymore, we can keep on preaching, but nobody listens, okay? And this is really pretty much what I've been observing happening. And once you are not necessary to capital accumulation in material conditions, in structural condition of capital accumulation as they are today, we are necessarily marginalized and substituted by other devices, okay? And these other devices are the logic of the algorithm and the logic of prediction, okay? So in a way, this is an observation of what is occurring. We're all very sad. We all miss something, for sure. But the question is, what do we miss? And should we miss what we miss, okay? So if I look at my own analysis in the past, I say, well, do I really miss the law? I don't know. The law certainly served a very imperialistic project through modernity, served much more the power than the powerless. Therefore, perhaps is not something we should miss so much in general, but we should see at those aspects, those fundamental aspects of the legal logic that are substituted by the logic of the internet frontier that we miss and maybe we should miss, okay? So what do we miss about the law? Why we kind of feel bad if we say the law is dead, okay? Can be a claim that is a little bit exaggerated, but I don't believe so much, and quite frankly, that is exaggerated. It certainly is exaggerated to a given extent because we still see law playing a role, but the law is always playing, the role is more and more marginal, especially in the internet frontier. Look at what's happening in Europe with now the critiques of the GDPR and all the critiques of, the attempts to deploy legal instruments in order to civilize in some way the relationship of between the big platforms and the human beings, okay? So what we miss is fundamentally, I believe, are a few things. First of all, is the position of the decision maker as neutral to the controversy. Okay, the decision maker has been assumed, the judge typically, but the decision maker more generally, is someone that is considered outside of the specific interest of the social conflict. It's not one of the two. If the third party decides, big brackets, can be captured, usually finds for the stronger. That is all true, but the fundamental posture, okay, is that of a third party deciding a conflict in which it has no stakes. This is not true anymore on the internet. There is no third party decision making. The logic is the logic of take it or leave it. The logic is the platform makes the law, writes it down in its own conditions of service. You have to accept those conditions if you want to access the domain of the platform, which is becoming more and more a political domain, more and more a domain where we live our lives. We have to accept the conditions to enter there, and those conditions are given by the stronger to the weaker. There is no third part check on what is going on. If you don't accept the condition of Facebook, you don't use Facebook. If you don't accept the conditions of Zoom, you don't use Zoom. Take it or leave it, okay? This take it or leave it logic is very different from the logic that we miss from the law. Because since a very long time, the law has been a decision process by a third party capable to convince both the winner and the loser that the decision was fundamentally sound, okay? We consider a legal tradition and the legal decisions once there is some principle, some capacity to motivate the decision in such a way that even the loser says, well, you know, I was unlucky this time, I might win next time, or can claim that there is something unjust, but there is anyway an attempt to find a solution that is principled, which is what we teach to our students basically every day, right? The student of law school gets out of law school, what he has to maintain, you know, is some sense of legal principles. Will become a jurist in the moment in which he's capable to handle articulation, interpretation, motivations in such a way to create principles that are connected to what we call the legal culture. Nothing like that exists on the internet frontier. Okay, that's one point that we might miss. The law should not be given, is given by the stronger to the weaker, and therefore is one-sided, is on the side of the platform, period. Is on the side of the big platforms that are today the oligopolies that some people have even compared to, you know, feudal overlords. Varoufakis wrote recently an interesting book on that. The other thing that we miss quite a bit is a level of intimacy behind the mask of the persona. Okay, the legal person is a mask behind which we have and we keep a level of intimacy that is irrelevant from the social transaction. Okay, I can believe that Rossato is the worst person in the world. I can hate him very deeply. I can desire all sorts of suffering imposed of someone of you, but that is completely irrelevant for the legal system as long as I don't strike him with a punch. Okay, so what happens within me is structurally protected by the mask from the intervention of the law. The law doesn't care about what I really feel. What it cares about is what I do. Okay? This is again something that is completely opposite to the logic of prediction. The logic of prediction is actually to try to understand as deeply as possible, as much within each one of us as it's possible. And, you know, neuro devices and all these kind of things are there for that purpose, in order to predict what I will do because of who I am. Okay? So what becomes important is who I am and not what I do. This is another thing that we can miss quite a bit because, you know, we don't like the idea that Google knows what I really deeply believe. And sometimes Google knows that even more than me. If it is true that, on your likes and all the signals we give over the internet, they can reconstruct an idea of our personality that is possible, more detailed than the idea of ourselves we do have. And so they can predict that Ugo Mattei at 5 o'clock in the afternoon desires chocolate. Okay? And at 4:30, I will find an advertising that I can have a Toblerone carried to my hotel room in 15 minutes. Okay, just clicking on this on this button. Okay, so the desire is a predicted by behavior. This is extremely important and is politically very relevant because it's not just about, if I desire chocolate, but it's also about my political beliefs, what kind of society I desire, what feelings I have towards a ruler, all these kind of things that are very important for power in order to control the society and maintain it under its fist. Okay? That is another very, very important separation, the logic of prediction. Other point is that prediction is forward-looking. Okay? Prediction always is something that bets statistically on what will happen at some point. Okay? At some point, Ugo Mattei desired Toblerone. At some point, Ugo Mattei is so angry that will try to shoot the prime minister. Okay? At some point, this thing might happen. There is a likelihood that it happens, and therefore, I preventively determine the fact that I keep him doing something or not doing something out of the probability that it happens. So it's forward-looking, okay? Whereas the law has been traditionally backwards-looking. What happened in the parking lot between car A and car B? They crashed against each other, then they fought, they entered a fist fight, something happened and has to be solved as something that historically occurred in society. Out of what historically occurred, then the decisions are taken. Whereas in the logic of prediction, nothing occurred. Decisions are taken about what is likely to happen because we know so much about each one of the parties involved in the conflict that we know very well in advance that that guy is more likely to give the fist or that guy is more likely to have driven like a crazy guy his own car that is controlled by a smart device that knows exactly how fast I drive, where I go, and all of these kind of things. Okay, so the forward-looking against the backward-looking. These are logics that are very, very different and very, very troublesome for anybody who works within the liberal paradigm of modern constitutionalism. And because these transformations are happening, because of the great substitution, constitutional liberalism itself is declining dramatically. And we will see there, I don't need to give, examples, from Donald Trump to what is occurring, to legal structures in international law, for example. It is very clear that we are way beyond the limits that the law imposes on the way that power works, okay? Now, if we look things like more philosophically, in a way, the internet frontier not only works on a take it or leave it logic, which is the logic of the stronger, and which is a political logic. See, we see how political it is when we look, for example, at Africa, right? The conditionality plans, the World Bank saying either you privatize the port or I will not give you the money that you desperately need to pay your civil servants, okay? Take it or leave it. Yes, I privatize the port, okay? That is not law. That is a power relationship that has nothing to do with the reasonableness of privatizing the port. Privatizing the port might be a very unreasonable decision. It's just in the interest of some power. You take it anyway because it is a political imposition. Okay, take it or leave it, which is exactly the political imposition we suffer hundreds of hours a day, hundreds of minutes a day when we accept the conditions when we go online. Yes, click. Yes, I agree. And we don't read nothing but what we agree. We just enter in a logic of take it or leave it, which is the non-legal logic, okay? Which is something very different. But the logic of the internet is also similar to the political logic from another point of view, which is much more worrisome. That goes back to the old idea of Kashmir, the logic of friend and enemy. The law doesn't work out of a logic of friend and enemy. In the Western legal tradition, the legal culture works in a logic based on some substantial equality. The judge doesn't have a friend or an enemy. When a judge arrives there always already having a friend of an enemy, we say this is not justice. This is just a facade. You know, you read Kafka, you look at the Stalinist trials of Bukharin, all these kind of things, and you know very clearly that you can have a facade, or the Nuremberg trial, if we really want to say it, you have a facade of legality out of a political decision. Why? Because the law works in certain moments on a friend and enemy logic. Okay, but that is a pathology of the law. Is not the structure in which the law should work. The law should work out of principles, and those principles are those that reflect the culture, okay, around which, you know, in elaborating these principles of relationship, you know, is where legal science, legal precedents, legal reflection, legal philosophy work. Okay, elaborate principles of good principled decision, different, opposite from the logic of friend and enemy. Okay, now the internet frontier works on a binary scale, which is also very close to the logic friend and enemy. This is why we are so worried, or some of us is so worried about what is going on, because we basically work with a collective enterprise, which is to locate ourselves in a way which is compatible with our having been reduced to data. Okay, and these data are governed by the power in order to consider who are their friends that should be facilitated in their life, and who are their enemies that should be excluded, should be marginalized, should be controlled, should be put in trouble in all sorts of ways, because they are, you know, basically interfering with the accumulation of capital. Okay, so these two logics, okay, of the internet frontier are so opposite to the logics of the law that as lawyers, we are deeply worried. We're not just worried because some already few weeks ago, you may know that ChatGPT passed the California bar. Okay, so ChatGPT was able to pass the California bar. That means that you can have the exam for becoming a lawyer. So you can actually now rely on ChatGPT as much as you would rely on some guy who exited law school, paid some $250,000 of fees in 3 years, okay, and now is a lawyer because he is able to pass the California bar. Today, the machine passes the California bar, and in a very short period of time, the machine is not only going to pass the California bar, it's going to become better than most lawyers in the kind of technological role in which the law has been reduced. So this is worrisome, right? Because we are teaching people to do stuff that the machine does as well as they do, and we kind of find it very difficult to maintain and to keep a narrative that say, oh, it's still worthwhile to go to law school. This is, something that today looks weird, but for example, in the United States, the liberal colleges are already experiencing a very dramatic decline in students that go to college, because when you go out of college, you are unemployed because the machine is able to do the kind of job that you could do by coming out of a liberal arts college in the United States. Okay, so this is, again, a very visible sign of the substitution, of the great substitution we have to look. Now, the question now is, because is this only bad news, or are there some good news here? okay? We should be very, so to say, materialistic in observing the conditions. These are the material conditions of the present. We can like them or dislike them. Our personal feeling about them as an individual is completely irrelevant. We have to try to understand how this logic works and whether there are possibilities of development capable to save what we actually believe we miss from the legal culture. How can we maintain those fundamental aspects of civilized human organization, which is within a system that has the great substitution occurring? Okay? And here is where I believe we are at this point. I think at this point, the frontier of our understanding as lawyers should be to try to see whether it's only bad news, and on the bad news, we have a lot of catalogs, okay? We had a moment in which there was this techno-optimism around 15 years ago, but those people that were techno-optimists at the time today have no real credibility at all, because the critical part, the problems occurred and emerged very brutally, okay? So now there is an hegemony in general thinking of worrying about what these guys like Altman or Thiel are doing in the Silicon Valley, because we are scared, basically, that what they are doing is not at all good news, okay? It's just something to be scared of that we have to contrast in some way or another. The question is, first question, is only bad news? Is there some good news out there if we open up our observation and if we serve as comparative lawyers at this point, okay? So we try to open up as much as we can our point of observation in order not to be capped within an echo chamber that is the West. You know, this idea that the West is everything is technically an echo chamber. We know nothing or very little about what is happening in the rest. Okay, so the question is now, is there only good news or some good news? Now, to me, the good news are very clear to see, okay? And the first important good news is that Friedrich von Hayek is dead. He's dead not just physically, but he's dead as an intellectual figure that has determined Hayek, Friedman, the big guys of the neoliberal period they made their living on the assumption that planning was impossible, that it was impossible to organize any kind of social planning because you had no knowledge sufficient in order to plan, okay? So the theory of knowledge of Hayek was asking for property rights, private law, contracts, markets, in order to create the amount of knowledge through the price system that is necessary to do any social organization. And what they pointed at was the Soviet Union. They said, see, the plan in the Soviet Union collapsed. You go at the GUM stores behind Moscow in I went myself there, 85, 86. I needed a pair of boots because it was very cold during the winter. I entered in the shop. There were hundreds of pair of boots, size 42. And there were no size 44, no size 45, no size 49, only 42. One size fits all, okay? Why? Because they had missed the planning. They produced a lot of shoes of size 42, okay? And all the other shoes that were different sizes were gone. The leftovers were an enormous amount of shoes, size 42, that was not actually the average, okay? So that was the visible sign that Hayek had it right. In the technological conditions of the end of history, okay, 1989, 1990, okay, in those technological conditions, it was necessary to have the market and to have property rights in order to have enough knowledge to organize society. No market, no knowledge, no good organized society, collapse of the Soviet Union. That was the story that made, the Thatcher-Reagan paradigm the winner, okay? We cannot live without the existence of a private sector that is very thriving, as large as possible, because the public sector is incapable of working because it doesn't have enough knowledge. It was a very substantial intellectual point. A lot of the left didn't see it. And that was a mistake. When they discovered it, it was too late. And as always happens when someone discovers things later, then they exaggerate. And this is exactly what happened, in the 90s and in the early part of this century. Now, all of that is not true anymore. The possibility of social planning through the datization of individuals, so through making the subjects objects, talking about humans and things, we become things. In the moment in which we are reduced to data, those data are a commodity, is a commodification of the individual, okay? This is what's happening. This commodification of the individual, nevertheless, doesn't require a subjectivity of the individual in like paying prices in order to do planning, okay? So planning now is possible. And we are seeing that happening already very, very clearly in other parts of the world. In China, through planning, it was possible to clean up Beijing in 3 years. It was very dirty, believe it. In China, through planning, was possible to close the gap or to limit the gap between the countryside and the city in a dramatic way. In China, it was possible to go out to take almost 1 billion people, 150 million people out of poverty, when in the capitalist world, 85 million new poor developed in the United States. So it's clear that there is a possibility of planning. Centralized planning is alive and well. This to me, thinking as a human living in the world, right? A human being in a world is good news. I don't care about whether it is well done or badly done, whether I like it or not. What it matters is that in the current condition, planning is possible. And because planning is necessary for many, many of the predicaments of our current world, first of all, the ecological crisis. Ecological crisis needs planning to be serious. There is no question about that. That is a tool that we have. Now, the question then arises, okay, we have at least one good news, okay? That we can look forward and organize something for the future. But as lawyers, we're very bad at that. All the legal categories that are forward-looking are depressed. Think about principles such as, very important principles, like the principle of precaution, okay? The principle of precaution is fundamental in order to understand how a society should develop in order to avoid massive disasters. Yet, it's a completely depressed principle. Why? Because we have an incapacity to look forward. We cannot really work as adjudicators, as lawyers, within the paradigm of prediction. Now, the principles of precaution, for example, could become something that develops and unfolds, okay? So there are things that lawyers can improve in their own vision of society by taking into account what the reality is today out there. And the reality, we have to call it with its name, is a commodification of human life. Now, this commodification of human lives can be at the service of capital accumulation, or could be at the service of some other project. Could be again at the service of socialism, if you like that. Could be at the service of a society that is cosmopolitan. Could be at the service of many things. Right now, in the West, it is at the service of making Bezos more and more rich. So this is what is happening today, right? We are using this transformation with a collective project, which is making the rich richer, reaching a point of unsustainability of the social differences and the social diversity. We can cure that by commodification of humans. What are the kind of things we have, however, to safeguard of the previous order? These are good news, yes, but there are some issues and some predicaments that we don't like. We don't like to become a commodity, for example. We believe that areas, spaces of subjectivity, maybe not individual, but at least collective, should be maintained. Okay? So we believe that. I believe that everybody believes that in some way or another, right? We don't like to have a society in which we are all reduced to commodities and therefore like in a sort of Orwellian / Huxleyan paradigm, we kind of serve as little, puppets in the hands of the power. Might be already true and might have been true for a long time, So, but these are other. But we have that predicament at the issue that we want to face. How do we handle that? What would be the frontiers? Of course, I have no answers. This is out of the question. But I have some research areas that I would like to suggest. Okay, some areas in which I believe there could be, in a very so to say, interdisciplinary, as they like to say today, way, food for thought for lawyers of fundamental research that could be lawyers and social scientists, of course, those that care about the organization of society, basically, that could be developed and used or at least approached and studied deeply in a very different way that we do today, because today we don't do it very simply. Okay, one thing that is, to me, very clear is that we have to figure out a way to introduce some kind of social values other than accumulation of capital within the machine. Okay, the machine should be fed with some kind of values that are not just the data captured in order to make Bezos and Altman richer, but are data that have to be factored in the machine in order to maintain the possibilities of having an organized planning, respectful and in tune with some of the necessity of community, of nature, of the individual. So opening up a dialogue with information engineers is extremely important. Having some subjectivity and some political subjectivity within the professional group that is substituting lawyers, because lawyers are substituted today by engineers and information engineers and coding. Okay, that kind of dialogue is very important, and that maybe is something that we can still do in spite of the fact that we are useless for capital accumulation. They might not like us, but not everybody. Okay, there is not just capitalism Western style. Opening a dialogue with engineers, opening a dialogue with those kind of frontiers requires a hard-nosed look into the way in which things work in China, in Russia, in the south of the world, in places where they are less invested in a vision of society based on constitutional liberalism. Okay, where there is not this idea of constitution. Europe obsessed with privacy, for example. The obsession with maintaining some aspects of individual agency just doesn't work if you don't think that in a broader picture. Let alone the fact, and this opens up another huge other area of what is going to happen with quantum computing, because quantum computing is going to make just another shift away from the world to which we are familiar. Okay, so we are really facing an acceleration in social transformation that is quite dramatic, and we have to be there in that particular point. And the other point that is very important, I believe, as a venue of research for lawyers or social scientists, is to figure out the relationship between planning and contracts. Planning and contracts. Okay. That was a question that was discussed in the Soviet Union at a very high level in the 30s, whether planning required the complete objectivization of the individual, or whether planning could work out of some aspects of subjectivity. Okay, and of course, then the Stalinist purges closed the issue, but now we have to reopen the relationship between the plan, the contract, and private property. To go towards, and I'm done, I'm sorry if I was a little long, but to go towards what? To go towards basically a theory of law that is at the same time relational, and we are having that in property, emerging here and there, okay? Law as a relational kind of discourse and not as a savage, mechanistic kind of discourse. and law, in a way, a relational law that looks at the future. Okay, so that is, to me, what we should actually try to do as lawyers if we want to save a role as in the making of the social fabric. I'm sorry that it was very kind of rhapsodic, but I figured it was here among friends and students of former students of mine, and it was good to share where I am. And thank you very much for your attention.